Okay, well, welcome everyone. I hope you can all hear me and see my slides. If you could give me a thumbs up, that would be much appreciated. Thank you. Now, just allow a few more people just joining. I'll give those people a mo. Okay, let's get started. So welcome to this afternoon's webinar on the England Woodland Creation Offer, or UCO as we call it for short. This afternoon's webinar will be focusing on recent updates to the grant. We don't have a huge number of slides to show you. The content's relatively short and sweet, so hopefully there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end of the session. So what we'd really like is if you could put any questions you have in the chat, and then we can go through them one by one when we get to the end. This session is being recorded, so please be aware of that, and we will hope to circulate recording of the webinar and we'll upload it to our YouTube, all things going well. So finally, before we jump into it, yeah, if you could just make sure you're muted, that would be very much appreciated. Oh, and I should say who I am as well. My name's Annie Weddle. I'm one of the grant managers, and I'm joined here this afternoon by Vicky Howlett, another one of the grant managers, and also Louise Alexander, one of our project officers who will be helping with the Q&A. What we're going to look at this afternoon is we'll have a look at two of the updates that we made earlier on in the year. So look at the capital rate and cap changes, and also at the HS2 Woodland Fund. Then have a look at the most recent updates that were announced on the 12th of July. So that's the new forms, standard cost items, expansion of eligibility, and some new guidance and forms around amendments and changes to agreements. Before just a final reminder on the biosecure procurement requirement before we go into the Q&A session. So starting off then, right at the beginning of the year, 5th of January, we announced that we were revising our capital payment rates. So on the board, across the board, we saw an average uplift of about 20%. So of all of our standard cost items that we pay for, so the trees, the fences, the gates, all those items, and across the board, most were increased. A few stayed the same, a few decreased, but like I said, we saw an average uplift of 20% there. And we increased the cap on those items by 20% as well to accommodate those rate changes. So hopefully this was really good news for lots of people. Another piece of the good news, I hope, back then was that we said that we would implement all of those changes as well. So neither applicants or agreement holders need to do anything, and we would do it all behind the scenes. So I'm pleased to say after a huge amount of effort by our team, that's now been done. So we notified grant recipients, we sent letters around to everyone who were affected by these changes. For quite some time now, we've been issuing all new agreements at the new rates. So even if applications had been submitted on forms with the old rates, all the agreements have been going out on the new rates, and we've just changed that our end. And then any eligible claims that we'd already paid. So we were saying by eligible as any claims that we would receive from the 1st November 2022 were eligible to be paid at the new rates. So when we made this announcement in January, obviously we'd already paid a number of those claims. And what we've done is we've gone over, worked out the difference, and we've made top-up payments to all of those that were eligible. And so that's now finally been done as well. So yeah, good news across the board, I hope. More recently, we announced that we're incorporating the HS2 Woodland Fund into UCO. So on the 30th of May this year, this was announced. So all those HS2 woodland creation applications will now be through UCO. But what does that really mean in practice? Well, it kind of means that all applications are submitted as sort of standard UCO applications. And all those proposals that are within the HS2 buffer zone, we will check them, and if they meet the design requirements for nature recovery, additional contribution, the native woodland one, if they're in the buffer zone and they meet those requirements, they'll be eligible for funding from HS2. Applicants can opt out. So if they don't want to take the HS2 funding and would rather have the Nature for Climate Fund funding, then they can opt for that. You can have this conversation with your woodland officer and you'll get the opportunity to opt out at the agreement offer stage. Okay, so now handing over to Vicky to look at the application forms.
Thanks, Annie. So as of the 12th of July, which was last Wednesday, we made a further update to UCO. So we'll run through all of those changes. The first part of that was we made some improvements to our application forms. So previously, if you're familiar, we had the application form part A, which was a PDF document, and we had an application form part B, which was an Excel document. So we've done quite a lot of work to streamline the application process and remove duplication between those two parts of the form. So essentially now all of the data information is collected through the single PDF form, through the single Excel form. The PDF exists now as a declaration form, and its sole purpose is to collect the signature from the applicant. So essentially we've merged the part A and B together, so all information is collected in that one single form. Just to make you aware, in case you've got any applications being worked up at the moment, we have a grace period, so we're going to continue accepting those previous versions of the forms until the end of the summer, until 31st of August. From the 1st of September, we will only accept these new versions, so please be aware of that if you're working up applications at the moment. So in terms of what this looks like, the Excel form now has 10 mandatory tabs to complete. Tab 8, the infrastructure tab, is only mandatory if you are applying for those payments towards infrastructure. Tabs 1 and 2 are kind of the headline changes, so they're new tabs which absorbs most of that information that was originally on the part A. The other tabs are fairly similar to what they were before, with just some streamlining and some duplication removed. So the blue Woodland Creation Plan tabs still exist in the form. They're still only mandatory if you do not have an approved Woodland Creation Design Plan through the Woodland Creation Planning Grant on the land. So if you do have one of those, there's no need to complete these blue tabs. They used to disappear very cleverly in the form. Unfortunately, that no longer happens due to the macro in the form and it being downloaded from gov.uk. They will, however, grey out, and hopefully it is quite clear that you don't need to complete them if you have that stage 2 approved planning grant, and the application is based off of that planning grant. And then finally, we have those orange reference tabs, which you should be familiar with, and those haven't changed. Nothing to complete on those ones, just for reference. Moving on, so we've added some new standard cost items to the UCO menu. So a lot of this came out of stakeholder feedback and also feedback internally from our woodland officers who are out on the ground, talking to people submitting their UCO applications. Just to make you aware, first off, please do go and look at that Appendix 1 to the UCO grant manual, which goes into more detail about these new items. But just to run through them as a kind of headline, so we have a new supplement for the use of individual tree wraps. so they can be used as an alternative to spirals or shelters. The benefits being they offer a better microclimate, ease of herbicide treatment, and also more robust than using spirals. So they are now an option. We have also added temporary electric fencing to be used where there is a low to moderate deer risk. So again, this came out of feedback from land managers not wanting to install a permanent deer fence around their site. Just to be clear, that temporary fence must be in place for the duration of the UCO agreement. And if you're applying for that item, that should be discussed and agreed with the woodland officer that it's appropriate to be used on that site. Moving on, we have badger tubes, so to be placed along fence lines as an alternative or in addition to traditional badger gates. Again, please look at that appendix for the specification if you're thinking about applying for those. We have added deer repellent. So that's a chemical deer repellent, and that is costed per application per tree. So applications last around 6 months. So you would be looking at a maximum of about 4 applications in that 2-year capital funding window. Again, the idea is to try and reduce the use of plastics, but you would also need to think about long-term protection and management if you were to apply for that. And then finally, we have added culverts to provide a new or replace an existing structure to provide a watercourse crossing. So on capital items, similarly, we have removed the need to supply 3 quotes where you're applying for those payments towards infrastructure. So where the total cost of the work will cost less than £5,000, you won't need to supply those 3 quotes to apply for those payments. And that's the total value, including agent fees and VAT where applicable. Again, this is in response to feedback that collecting those quotes for lower value items was quite time consuming. So we're just attempting to try and reduce that burden a little bit here. And then we have also removed the cap on the 5% of the remaining UCO budget. But just to be aware that these payments towards infrastructure are still capped at 10% of the total value of standard costs in the application. Okay, handing back to Annie.
Thanks, Vicky. Okay, so looking at expanding eligibility, for about a year now, we've had these standard cost items for drinking water for livestock. And when we introduced them, they were restricted to be used only where the riparian buffer additional contribution was being applied for. We stripped that restriction out now. So these items are now available across the board, but again, as always, only when they're needed. So in this instance, when the new woodland is going to obstruct livestock access to the usual drinking water supply. And then looking at expanding eligibility with our additional contributions. Here we've made a change to the nature recovery additional contribution for the creation of habitat for red squirrel. So up until now, the application the site needs to sit within the targeting layer. Whereas we've increased the flexibility. We're saying if you're not in that spatial targeting layer, you can still apply for this additional contribution. If the woodland officer is in agreement and where this is agreed with red squirrels Northern England. So they need to confirm the presence of red squirrel and also support the application. So again, hopefully 2 good pieces of good news.
Sorry, just to jump in, Annie, I don't think your slide changed on that last point. We're still on expanding eligibility. Standard cost item slide. It's got stuck.
How about now?
No, I'll try and take control and see if it moves along. Any thumbs up to see if it's moved? Perfect. Are you happy to move on, Annie? I'll just give people a minute to read that slide.
Yeah, happy to move on once people have had a moment to digest.
Okay, so I'll move on. We can come back to that if you have any questions at the end. So we have now formalised the process for making amendments to live grant agreements. And we have issued a new appendix to the grant manual, which is Appendix 6, which covers this amendment update and also change of ownerships, which I'll run through on the next slide. To go with this, we have also issued an amendment request form. So we understand that sometimes in reality need to change compared to what's in paper on the agreement, but we also don't have the resource or the capacity to renegotiate agreements once they have been assessed and approved by our team. So for basic principles, grant funds can't increase once the grant agreement is in place, and they also can't be the funds can't be shared out between different items that weren't originally in the application. We may consider the removal of certain elements. So, for example, an entire land parcel or compartment might be removed from the application, or perhaps a single gate, things like that. So in agreement with the Woodland officer, if the site will remain viable with that change, we will consider it. Species mix, again, we understand that it's not always possible to source stock exactly in line with what's in the agreement, and we do expect a bit of variation. Generally, if it's quite a small change, this can be discussed and agreed with the Woodland officer and doesn't need to be this formal amendment. It can just be managed through that claim process. So, for example, if you're swapping a native broadleaf for a native broadleaf, but if that overall species mix is changing, then we do need to approve that before we agree to fund those trees. So this is just so that we can check suitability to the site, that those trees have a good chance of being successful, and also the use of any lesser known species that have not been assessed by our resilience team. Finally, just to reiterate that work completed outside of the agreement cannot be funded. So if that work has gone ahead before we've agreed to it, we wouldn't be able to fund that work. So please do wait to receive an amendment offer in writing before undertaking any work. So in that same Appendix 6 to the grant manual, we have some new guidance on change of ownership and management control. So we have also issued a new change of management control notification form. We must receive that to notify us within 3 months of a change of management control taking place. And as part of that, if the lead applicant or agreement holder will no longer have control of the land, a succession can be requested through that change of management control form to transfer the obligations and benefits of the agreement to a new grant recipient. Just to say, successions are subject to our usual due diligence checks before they can be offered, so that they aren't 100% guaranteed, but it is preferable that transfer does happen rather than closing any agreements. And then linked to that, we are now offering a pilot scheme. So it's an optional pilot on tenanted land, whereby tenants and landlords can apply together, and it gives the option for the landlord to supply their single business identifier or their SBI number at application stage when they countersign that application. So this will then allow us to undertake due diligence checks on both parties, and it would remove the need for us to undertake that formal succession process further down the line. So this is something that we agreed to pilot in response to the ROC review that DEFRA published earlier this year, with the intention that we hope to be facilitating woodland creation on tenanted land. Just to reiterate, tenants have always been able to apply to UCO and can continue to do so as part of this pilot or outside of it. It is optional, as I said, and the tenant will still remain the lead applicant or the grant recipient until we are notified otherwise. As part of this, we are also clarifying our position on reclaims. There will be further guidance coming at a later date, but as a general rule, reclaims will always be sought from the person who was in receipt of those grant funds originally. So regardless as to whether that person is still an agreement holder or party to the agreement or not. So in doing so, we do encourage private indemnity clauses in tenancy and land sale agreements to ensure protection in a reclaim scenario. And this is something that is in line with our previous grant offer and also the government's grant functional standard. Back to you, Annie.
Thanks, Vicky. Okay, let's hopefully you can see. I think I know what's going wrong. I need to make sure I take back control. Okay, can you see the procurement requirement on the screen? Lovely, thank you. Okay, so this was just a reminder about the biosecure procurement requirement, which was a pilot launched 22nd of June last year, so just over a year into the pilot, and it is ongoing, and it's recently been expanded to some other grant schemes as well. So a quick reminder what that requirement is. So we want suppliers of plants and trees to demonstrate they can meet the biosecurity requirements as set out in the published Plant Health Management Standard, and they can do this in one of two ways. So category A, so the UCO grant recipient can buy their trees from a nursery who is a current member of the Plant Healthy Certification Scheme or have officially applied to be a member of that certification scheme. And the alternative is that they can purchase from a nursery who is happy to get a ready to plant assessment conducted by Ferrous Science. So it's not just Plant Healthy certified or applicant nurseries who are eligible. Yeah. Obviously this has been running for a year now, but with the timeframes involved, we've only really had a limited number of claims that are come through that are subject to this requirement. And whilst on the whole it's been going well, there's definitely been one issue that's cropped up. So we thought this was a perfect opportunity to run through that with you. And basically the problem has been that our grant recipients have had conversations with their nurseries ahead of purchasing, and the nursery has been, yep, we're going to apply for Plant Healthy certification, will be certified by the time you order your trees. And of course, they come around to order their trees and the grant recipient's not checked. And actually, then they're not eligible. So what the message we're trying to push home now is grant recipients really do need to check that if they're purchasing from a nursery who say they're going down the Plant Healthy certification route, they do need to go onto the Plant Healthy website, and on there where I've highlighted in the red circle here, you can click on the directory of certified businesses. That will take you to the page at the bottom here. So there's a map, but also moving on to this next slide, you can see basically there's a list of all certified nurseries and also applicants as well. So it actually doesn't matter whether the nursery is certified or whether they're just an applicant. Either is fine, but they do need to be there on that web page. Okay, if they're not there, then they're not eligible. So yeah, we're really keen to kind of spread this message. Happy to take questions on that at the end as well. Which I actually think we've kind of come to the end of the content, so we're ready to jump into Q&A.